Wood, slamming against wood, shouldn't have the power to erase a mother's entire world. Yet that single strike of the gavel shattered Campbell's reality into jagged fragments. Physical custody is hereby awarded to the father, the judge's voice echoed, cold and absolute. Campbell tuned out the rest of the legal jargon. Her eyes locked on the imperceptible smirk, settling across her ex-husband David's perfectly shaved jawline. 8 years of midnight fevers and scraped knees vanished in an instant, wiped away by high-priced corporate lawyers who successfully painted her as unstable. Stepping out of the courtroom, she carried nothing but the clothes on her back and a crushing, hollow silence. The air in the Fulton County Courthouse smelled of floor wax and stale anxiety. Campbell Reed sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, her knuckles white as she gripped the edges of the mahogany surface. Beside her, her attorney, Sarah Jenkins, was hastily packing legal pads into a worn leather briefcase, her movements tight with defeated frustration. "I'm so sorry, Campbell," Sarah murmured, her voice barely carrying over the shuffle of departing spectators. "We knew Judge Harrison leaned conservative, but David's team, they manufactured a narrative we just couldn't outrun." Campbell couldn't speak. If she opened her mouth, the scream clawing at her throat would tear through the courtroom. Across the aisle, David Hughes stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal suit. He didn't look like a man who had just won custody of his 8-year-old son, Leon. He looked like a CEO who had just successfully executed a hostile takeover, which, in a way, was exactly what he had done. David's lead attorney, Richard Gable, leaned in to whisper something to him, and David let out a short, hollow laugh. The sound snapped Campbell out of her paralysis. She stood up, her knees trembling so violently she had to brace herself against the chair. "When does he take him?" Campbell asked, her voice cracking. "Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m., at his residence," Sarah replied gently, placing a hand on Campbell's shoulder. "You have tonight, Campbell. Make it a good night. Don't let Leon see you fall apart." The drive back to her modest 2-bedroom apartment in Decatur was a blur of red taillights and blinding street lamps. Campbell's mind replayed the trial on an endless, torturous loop. David had used everything against her. Her temporary reliance on antidepressants after her mother's death, the freelance graphic design career that kept her working irregular hours, which David's team spun as financial instability, and an unpredictable environment. Meanwhile, David's inherited wealth, his sprawling estate in Buckhead, and his army of nannies were presented as the gold standard of stability. It didn't matter that David had missed 4 of Leon's birthdays, or that he didn't know the boy was terrified of the dark. Money had bought the truth. That night was the hardest of Campbell's life. She made Leon's favorite dinner, macaroni and cheese, with hot dogs cut into little stars, and they watched animated movies on the couch. Leon, blissfully unaware of the permanence of the judge's decree, fell asleep, with his head on her chest, his small fingers curled into the fabric of her sweater. Campbell stayed awake until dawn, watching the rise and fall of his breathing, memorizing the smell of his strawberry shampoo. The drop-off the next morning was a quiet, suffocating nightmare. The massive iron gates of David's estate swung open, welcoming them into a driveway paved with imported stone. David was waiting on the porch, flanked by a stern-looking woman in a uniform, the new nanny. "I'll see you on alternating weekends, buddy," David said, patting Leon awkwardly on the shoulder as the boy clung to Campbell's leg. "Mommy, why are you crying?" Leon asked, his lower lip trembling. "Are you going to be okay by yourself?" "I'm fine, my sweet boy," Campbell lied, forcing a smile that felt like shattered glass. She knelt down, inhaling his scent one last time. "You be good for your dad. I love you to the moon and back. To the moon and back," Leon whispered, as Campbell drove away, watching her son recede in the rearview mirror until he was swallowed by the immense shadow of the Hughes estate. The finality of it all crashed down on her. She pulled over to the shoulder of the road, and wept until she physically couldn't draw breath, her forehead pressed against the cold steering wheel. By the time she returned to her apartment, the silence was deafening. Toys were scattered on the rug. A half-finished puzzle sat on the coffee table. The ghost of her son was everywhere, and it was driving her mad. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, pitying texts from friends, logistical emails from Sarah, but she ignored them all. She needed to disappear. She needed a place where the air wasn't thick with memories and failure. Her eyes landed on an old, tarnished brass key, hanging on a hook by the door. It belonged to a property she had barely thought about in years. Aunt Beatrice's cabin. Hidden deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, the cabin had been willed to Campbell 3 years ago when Beatrice passed away. Campbell had paid the property taxes, but had never brought herself to visit. Beatrice had been a recluse, a fiercely independent woman who had severed ties with most of the family. It was isolated. It was remote. It was exactly what Campbell needed. She grabbed a duffel bag and began shoving clothes into it without looking. She didn't know what she was looking for: peace, oblivion, or just a place to scream, where no one could hear her. But she knew she couldn't survive another night in this apartment. The drive north was a grueling 6-hour journey that mirrored Campbell's internal descent. As she left the sprawling concrete veins of Atlanta behind, the landscape shifted. The highway narrowed, giving way to winding mountain roads flanked by towering, ancient pines. The GPS on her dashboard eventually lost its signal, the little blue arrow spinning aimlessly in a sea of grey pixels. Campbell didn't mind. She had Aunt Beatrice's handwritten directions, folded and tucked into the sun visor. Turn left at the rusted silo. Drive until the asphalt turns to gravel. Keep going until you think you're lost. Then go another mile. The air grew noticeably colder as she ascended into the Blue Ridge Mountains. Fog clung to the valleys like thick, spun sugar, hiding the sheer drops mere feet from her tires. By the time she reached the rusted silo, the sun was beginning to dip below the jagged horizon, casting long bruised shadows across the forest floor. The gravel road was brutal, rattling her aging Honda Civic to its core. Finally, after a grueling mile of dodging deep ruts and fallen branches, the trees parted. There it sat, Beatrice's cabin. It was a rugged, A-frame structure built from dark, weathered timber, nestled against the side of a steep incline. A wide porch wrapped around the front, overlooking a dense valley of untouched wilderness. It looked abandoned, lonely, and fiercely resilient. Campbell killed the engine. The silence that rushed in to fill the cabin of the car was absolute. No sirens, no traffic, no distant hum of city life. Just the wind, rushing through the upper canopy of the pines. She grabbed her duffel bag and a box of non-perishable groceries she'd hastily bought at a gas station and walked up to the porch. The wooden floorboards groaned in protest under her weight. Her hand trembled as she fitted the tarnished brass key into the deadbolt. With a stiff click, the door gave way. The inside of the cabin smelled of cedar wood, dust, and old paper. Campbell found the breaker box in the hallway and flipped the main switch. To her surprise, the electricity still worked, though the bulbs overhead flickered with a weak, yellow light. The interior was exactly as Beatrice had left it. A faded patchwork quilt was draped over a worn leather armchair. Bookshelves lined every available wall, crammed with hardcovers on botany, philosophy, and history. In the small kitchenette, a cast-iron skillet sat perfectly clean on the dormant stove. Campbell dropped her bags. The adrenaline that had carried her through the trial, the packing, and the drive finally evaporated, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She collapsed onto the leather armchair, pulling her knees to her chest, and let the isolation swallow her. The first 3 days were a blur of numb routine. Campbell slept for 14 hours at a time, waking only to drink bitter black coffee and stare out the large front window at the impenetrable forest. She felt like a ghost haunting her own life. She tried not to think of Leon, but her mind betrayed her constantly. She wondered who was making his lunch, if the new nanny knew to cut the crusts off his sandwiches, if David was actually spending time with him or just parading him around his country club. The thoughts were like physical blows, leaving her breathless and crying on the dusty floorboards. To keep from entirely losing her mind, Campbell began to clean. It was a mechanical, mindless task that required no emotional bandwidth. She scrubbed the countertops, swept away generations of cobwebs, and began sorting through Beatrice's belongings. Beatrice had always been the black sheep of Campbell's family. While Campbell's mother had embraced suburban normalcy, Beatrice had retreated from the world, choosing the company of trees over people. The family dismissed her as eccentric, maybe a little paranoid in her later years. On the fourth afternoon, while dusting the high shelves in the living room, Campbell knocked over a stack of leather-bound journals. They hit the floor with a heavy thud, a cloud of dust puffing up into the air. Campbell knelt to pick them up. The books were completely filled with Beatrice's cramped, erratic handwriting, curiosity piercing through her grief. Campbell opened the top journal. It was dated 5 years ago. Most of it was mundane notes on weather patterns, bird migrations, recipes for tinctures. But as Campbell flipped toward the back of the book, the tone shifted drastically. October 14th. They called again today. I didn't answer. Arthur thinks he can buy my silence, just like he buys everything else. But I know what he did. I know the foundation the Hughes empire is built on. Campbell stopped breathing. Arthur Hughes, David's father. Her eyes darted across the page, tracing the jagged, frantic ink. November 2nd. I saw a car parked at the bottom of the ridge. Black SUV, tinted windows. They are watching me. I need to make sure the records are safe. If anything happens to me, Campbell needs to know. But she's so young. How can I tell her that the man she loves is a spider, and she is just a fly in his web? The journal slipped from Campbell's hands, hitting the floorboards. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She reread the passage, her mind struggling to process the words. Beatrice knew David's father? More than that, Beatrice believed Arthur Hughes was having her watched. Campbell and David's meeting had been a fairy tale. Or so she had believed. That's that charity gala in Atlanta 7 years ago. She had spilled champagne on his shoes. He had laughed, bought her a new drink, and swept her off her feet. It had felt like destiny. But Beatrice's journal implied something far more sinister. It implied that Beatrice knew the Hughes before Campbell met David. What were you involved in, B? Campbell whispered to the empty room. The wind outside began to howl, a low, mournful sound that rattled the single-pane windows. Dark storm clouds were rolling over the ridge, turning the late afternoon sky into a bruised, menacing purple. Campbell felt a sudden, desperate urge to understand. The grief over losing Leon was suddenly eclipsed by a burning, terrifying question. Her marriage, her child, the custody battle. Was any of it a coincidence? She needed to find what Beatrice had hidden. I need to make sure the records are safe. Where would an eccentric, paranoid woman hide something important in a cabin she rarely left? The storm broke with a violent ferocity. Rain lashed against the A-frame roof like handfuls of gravel, and thunder shook the very foundations of the cabin. The weak electrical grid couldn't handle the weather. The lights flickered violently twice before dying completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. Campbell clicked on her phone's flashlight, the harsh white beam cutting through the gloom. She needed to search. The frantic energy of Beatrice's journal entries had infected her. She started in the bedroom, pulling apart the mattress, checking behind the heavy oak headboard, tapping on the walls, looking for hollow spaces. Nothing. She moved to the kitchen, emptying out cupboards containing decades-old canned goods and rusted tools. Still nothing. Hours passed. Outside, the storm raged on, completely isolating the cabin from the rest of the world. Campbell was covered in sweat and dust, her hands scraped from prying at stubborn cabinet doors. She stood in the center of the living room, panning her flashlight across the space. "Where did you put it, B?" she muttered, wiping a streak of grime from her forehead. Her flashlight beam caught the edge of the fireplace, a massive structure made of jagged river stones. Beside the fireplace was a built-in wooden bench that doubled as a storage trunk for firewood. Campbell had checked it earlier. It was full of dry logs, but as she stared at it now, something caught her eye. The baseboards beneath the bench didn't sit flush with the floor. There was a slight, unnatural gap, barely a quarter of an inch wide. Campbell dropped to her knees. She grabbed an old iron fire poker from the hearth and jammed the flattened end into the gap beneath the bench. She leaned her weight onto the poker, using it as a lever. The wood creaked, resisting for a moment, before a sharp snap echoed through the room. A section of the floorboard popped upward. Campbell shoved the poker aside and dug her fingers under the rough wood, pulling it away. Beneath the floorboard was a dark, narrow cavity excavated directly into the earth beneath the cabin. Resting inside was a heavy, olive-green metal lockbox. It looked like an old military surplus ammunition crate. She hauled it out. It was shockingly heavy. The box had a small padlock on the latch, but the metal was so corroded from the dampness beneath the floor that Campbell easily smashed it open with the heavy handle of the fire poker. She threw the lid back. The smell of old paper and mildew drifted up. Inside were neat plastic-wrapped bundles. Campbell pulled the first one out and tore the plastic away. It was a stack of bank ledgers, dating back nearly 30 years. She held her phone light close, her eyes scanning the columns. They were records of massive offshore transfers. Millions of dollars moving through shell companies in the Caymans, Cyprus, and Switzerland. And at the bottom of almost every page was a signature she recognized from her court documents. Arthur C. Hughes. "What is this?" she breathed. She dug deeper into the box. Beneath the ledgers was a thick manila envelope. She opened it and pulled out a stack of 8x10 photographs. Campbell felt the breath leave her lungs. The first photo was of a young girl, maybe 10 years old, riding a red bicycle down a suburban street. Campbell recognized the street. She recognized the bicycle. It was her. The photo had been taken from a distance, perhaps from a parked car. Her hands shaking violently, she flipped to the next photo. It was Campbell in high school, walking out of a movie theater with friends. The next was Campbell in college, sitting at a coffee shop in Savannah. There were dozens of them, a chronological timeline of her entire life, documented by an unseen watcher. At the bottom of the stack was a document printed on heavy, watermarked paper. It was an executive summary, drafted by a private intelligence firm. Subject: Campbell Reed. Objective: acquisition and integration. Campbell read the brief, her stomach twisting into sick, agonizing knots. The document detailed her psychological profile, her family history, and her vulnerabilities. It explicitly recommended a chance encounter at the Atlanta Charity Gala. It noted that her mother's declining health would make her susceptible to an older, wealthy, and seemingly stable partner. David hadn't fallen in love with her. He had been assigned to her. But why? Why would a billionaire real estate dynasty spend decades tracking a painfully average girl from middle-class Georgia? She reached into the very bottom of the metal box and pulled out a small, velvet-lined jewelry case. Inside wasn't jewelry, but a single, folded piece of stationery. It was a letter from Beatrice, addressed directly to Campbell. "My dearest Campbell, if you are reading this, I am dead, and Arthur Hughes has likely made his final move. I am so sorry I didn't protect you better. I was a coward. I thought if I hid, if I took the evidence with me, they would leave our family alone. I was wrong. You think David married you by chance. He did not. He married you for your bloodline. You see, Campbell, 35 years ago, Arthur Hughes didn't build his empire from scratch. He stole it. He stole it from your grandfather." Campbell stopped reading. Her vision blurred, black spots dancing at the edges of her sight. Her grandfather, Elias Reed, had died penniless in a tragic factory fire before Campbell was born. Her mother had never liked talking about it. Arthur and Elias were partners. The letter continued. Elias was the genius behind the patents. Arthur was just the money. When Elias threatened to expose Arthur for embezzling funds, Arthur ensured Elias never made it out of that factory. He took everything. But Elias was smart. He put a clause in the foundational trust of the Hughes Corporation, a kill switch. If an heir of Elias Reed ever discovered the original partnership agreements which are in the blue folder at the bottom of this box, they have the legal right to claim 51% of the Hughes empire. They couldn't kill you, Campbell. It would look too suspicious after your grandfather. So, Arthur devised a long-term plan. Have his son marry you, have a child with you, commingle the bloodlines so that when the trust matures, the Hughes family maintains control of the assets through your child, through Leon. Campbell dropped the letter. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. The custody battle. It wasn't about David wanting to be a father. It wasn't about him thinking Campbell was a bad mother. The trust was maturing. Leon was the heir. They needed full legal and physical control over Leon to ensure they controlled the billions of dollars tied to her grandfather's stolen legacy. David had systematically broken her down in court, not out of spite, but as a calculated business transaction to secure his empire. She looked at the blue folder resting in the bottom of the lockbox. The original partnership agreements. The proof. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside Campbell, the crushing, paralyzing grief she had felt for the past 4 days vanished. It was instantly incinerated, replaced by a cold, blinding fury. David Hughes thought he had broken a fragile, unstable woman. He thought he had taken her son and discarded her to rot in the mountains. He had no idea he had just handed her the very weapon she needed to destroy him. Campbell picked up the blue folder, clutching it to her chest. She wasn't going to cry anymore. She was going to war. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the Blue Ridge Mountains cloaked in a thick, eerie mist. Inside the cabin, Campbell had not slept a single second. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint, warm light across the documents spread over the wooden floorboards. She was no longer the shattered mother who had driven up the mountain 4 days ago. The weeping, helpless version of Campbell Reed had died in the dark, buried under the weight of Arthur Hughes's betrayal. In her place sat a woman hollowed out by grief and refilled with a cold, terrifying purpose. She carefully photographed every page of the ledgers, the private intelligence dossier, and the foundational trust documents with her phone. Then, she wrapped the originals in 2 layers of thick plastic garbage bags, sealed them with duct tape, and placed them back into the olive green metal lockbox. She wouldn't take the originals with her. If Arthur still had people watching her, she couldn't risk the physical proof falling into their hands. Armed with a heavy iron shovel from the shed, Campbell hiked 50 yards behind the cabin into the dense, rain-soaked pines. Beneath the roots of a massive, decaying oak tree, she dug a hole 3 feet deep, buried the lockbox, and covered it with stones and wet pine needles. It was invisible. Back inside, she scoured the rest of Beatrice's journals for any names or contacts. Beatrice was paranoid, but she wasn't a fool. She had been building a case. On the inside back cover of a journal dated 2 years prior, Campbell found a name jotted in hurried red ink. Thomas Abernathy. Follows the money, the only one Arthur couldn't buy. Beneath it was a faded Atlanta phone number. Campbell packed her duffel bag, leaving the cabin exactly as she had found it. The drive down the mountain was treacherous. The gravel road washed out in several places, but Campbell gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled determination. She didn't head straight back to Atlanta. That would be suicide. Instead, she drove west toward Waynesville, North Carolina. She parked her old Honda behind a rundown strip mall, far from the main road. Inside a flickering, fluorescent-lit convenience store, she purchased a cheap prepaid smartphone and $200 in cash cards. Sitting in the stale air of her car, Campbell activated the burner phone. She dialed the number from Beatrice's journal. It rang 6 times. She was about to hang up when a gruff, gravelly voice answered, "If this is about the unpaid server bills, I told you you'll get a check on Friday," the man snapped. "Thomas Abernathy?" Campbell asked, her voice steady. A pause on the line. "Who's asking? My name is Campbell Reed. I'm Beatrice Reed's niece." The silence that followed was so profound. Campbell thought the call had dropped. When Thomas finally spoke, the annoyance was gone, replaced by a sharp, guarded tension. "Beatrice is dead. Passed 3 years ago. If you're her niece, you should know that." "I do," Campbell said. "I also know about Arthur Hughes. I know about Elias Reed. And I know what's buried beneath the floorboards." A sharp exhale hissed through the phone speaker. "Where are you right now?" "North Carolina." "Headed south." "Don't go back to your apartment," Thomas ordered, his voice dropping an octave. "If you found the blue folder, you are a walking target. Do you think David fought for custody of your boy just to hurt you? The trust matures on the kid's 9th birthday. They needed legal control over him before the date." Campbell's blood ran cold. Leon's 9th birthday was in exactly 22 days. The ticking clock echoed in her ears like a hammer striking an anvil. "I need your help," Campbell said. "I have the proof. All of it. Drive to Greenville, South Carolina," Thomas instructed. "There's a 2-4-hour diner off Interstate 85 called the Rusty Spoon. Park in the back. Sit in the corner booth facing the door. If you think you're being followed, keep driving. 3 hours. Don't be late." The line went dead. Campbell tossed the burner phone onto the passenger seat. She pulled her sun visor down, checked her reflection in the mirror, and wiped a smudge of mountain dirt from her cheek. As she merged onto the highway, a sleek, black SUV pulled out from a side street 3 cars behind her. Campbell's eyes locked onto it in the rearview mirror. Tinted windows. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She sped up. The SUV matched her pace. She took a sudden, unsignaled exit, tires squealing on the wet asphalt. The SUV blew past the exit, continuing down the highway. Campbell let out a shaky breath, realizing her paranoia was going to be just as dangerous as the huggers themselves. She had a war to wage, and she needed to keep her head clear. The Rusty Spoon smelled of stale fryer oil and burnt coffee. It was 3:00 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the diner was mostly deserted, save for a trucker asleep in a booth and an elderly couple sharing a slice of pie. Campbell sat in the back corner, her back against the peeling vinyl, eyes locked on the front door. At 3:15, the bell above the door chimed. A man walked in. He was in his late 50s, wearing a rumpled corduroy jacket over a faded flannel shirt. His grey hair was unkempt, but his eyes sharp, pale blue, and hyper-alert, scanned the room in a fraction of a second. They landed on Campbell. He slid into the booth across from her without a word. He placed a battered leather satchel on the table. "You look like Elias," he said quietly. Got his jawline. "Are you Thomas?" "I am," he replied, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the carafe left on the table. "I used to be a forensic accountant for the IRS. I spent 4 years building a racketeering case against Arthur Hughes. Right before we were going to file, my lead witness died in a mysterious boating accident. My bank accounts were frozen under a false embezzlement investigation, and I was quietly forced into early retirement. Arthur is a ghost who leaves no footprints. So, forgive me if I'm skeptical. Show me what you have." Campbell pulled her burner phone from her pocket, opened the photo gallery, and slid it across the table. Thomas picked it up, squinting at the screen. As he swiped through the images of the ledgers, the offshore accounts, and the psychological dossier on Campbell, his posture stiffened. When he reached the photos of the foundational trust and the original partnership agreements bearing Elias Reed's signature, his pale blue eyes widened. "Mother of God," Thomas whispered reverently. "Beatrice actually found it. We thought he destroyed these in the factory fire. Arthur killed my grandfather to take the company," Campbell said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He manipulated my entire life to marry me off to David. And now, they have my son. They have Leon because they need his proxy when the trust vests in 3 weeks. I want my son back, Thomas. And I want them in prison. Thomas set the phone down and ran a hand over his face. Campbell, this isn't a family court issue anymore. This is a multi-billion-dollar federal fraud case. If Arthur finds out you have these documents, he won't bother with lawyers. You'll disappear. So, just like Elias. I'm already dead to the world, Campbell replied coldly. I lost my child, my home, my reputation. I have nothing left for them to take. That makes me dangerous. How do we beat them? Thomas tapped his fingers on the table, his mind working furiously. We can't just hand this to the police. Arthur owns half the judges in Fulton County, and the police chief plays golf at his country club. We need federal intervention, and we need a shark. We need Evelyn Roth. Who is Evelyn Roth? She's a ruthless corporate litigator out of New York. She specializes in corporate decapitation, tearing down monopolies and corrupt empires. She has a personal vendetta against Arthur. He tanked her father's hedge fund in the 90s. If I show her this, she'll take the case pro bono just to watch Arthur bleed. Thomas leaned in closer. But here is the problem. If Evelyn files the injunction to freeze the Hughes assets, Arthur will panic. His first move will be to secure his most valuable asset. Leon, Campbell breathed, feeling a spike of pure terror. Exactly. If we file this lawsuit while Leon is inside the Hughes compound, Arthur will use the boy as a shield. He'll fly him to a non-extradition country on a private jet before the ink on the subpoena is dry. You will never see your son again. Campbell gripped the edge of the table so hard her fingernails dug into the cheap wood. Then we get Leon out first. Before we file. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Get him out? Campbell, David's estate is a fortress. Private security, cameras, biometric locks. You can't just walk up and knock on the door. I know, Campbell said, her mind racing back to the drop-off. The massive gates. The stern-looking woman in the uniform. The new nanny. When I dropped Leon off, there was a new nanny on the porch, Campbell said slowly. David mentioned her in court. Margaret Higgins. He bragged about hiring her from a high-end agency. Thomas pulled a heavily modified laptop from his satchel and booted it up. Let me look into her. The agency David uses is prestigious, which means their employees are thoroughly vetted. But everyone has a vulnerability, a debt, a sick relative, a secret. His fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing databases Campbell couldn't even comprehend. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the clacking of keys and the distant hum of the diner's refrigerator. Suddenly, Thomas stopped typing. A low whistle escaped his lips. What? Campbell demanded. What did you find? Margaret Higgins is a highly qualified pediatric nurse and nanny. Flawless record. But Thomas turned the screen toward Campbell. She isn't just an employee. I dug into the shell company that pays her salary. It's not registered to Arthur, and it's not registered to David. Then who pays her? A trust fund managed by William Hughes, Thomas said, pointing to the name on the screen. Campbell blinked in shock. William was David's younger brother. He was the black sheep of the Hughes family. An artist who had completely severed ties with the family business years ago. David openly despised him, calling him a weak-willed parasite. Campbell had met William exactly twice in 7 years. He hadn't even attended their wedding. Why would William be paying the nanny in David's house? Campbell asked. Bewildered, Thomas smiled, a predatory gleam in his eye. Because William hates his father just as much as we do. He's been trying to find dirt on Arthur for a decade. I think Margaret isn't just a nanny, Campbell. I think William planted a spy inside his brother's house. And if I'm right, we just found our Trojan horse. The plan required them to walk straight into the lion's den. William Hughes did not live in the sprawling, manicured suburbs of Buckhead, like his brother and father. He resided in a converted, brutalist warehouse in the West Midtown district of Atlanta, a stark, industrial space that mirrored his deliberate severing from the family aesthetic. Thomas managed to secure a meeting through a secure, encrypted email channel he had retained from his IRS days. 24 hours after the revelation at the diner, Campbell and Thomas stood in a freight elevator, the metal grating clanking loudly as they ascended to William's top-floor studio. Campbell's nerves were a frayed wire. She was about to meet a man sharing the blood of the people who had stolen her child and murdered her grandfather. The elevator doors ground open, revealing a cavernous loft smelling of turpentine, stale cigarettes, and cold coffee. Massive canvases, violently splashed with dark, abstract oils, leaned against the exposed brick walls. In the center of the room stood William Hughes. He lacked David's polished, predatory grooming. His hair was overgrown, his jaw lined with silver stubble, and his hands were permanently stained with dark paint. "Thomas Abernathy," William said, his voice a low, raspy drawl. "I thought my father had you buried under a mountain of bogus litigation a decade ago. I dug myself out," Thomas replied flatly. "And I brought someone you need to meet." William's eyes shifted to Campbell. The casual indifference in his posture vanished. He took a slow step forward, studying her face with an uncomfortable intensity. "Campbell Reed, the sacrificial lamb. I warned David not to marry you. You know, I told him, playing God with people's lives always ends in a bloodbath. I don't care about your family's internal drama." "William," Campbell said, her voice surprisingly steady. The grief was gone, replaced by a cold, hardened edge that surprised even her. "I know about Elias. I know about the trust. And I know you placed Margaret Higgins inside David's house." William let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "My father spent millions trying to ensure you never figured out you were an heiress, and you unravel it from a cabin in the woods. Fascinating." He walked over to a metal workbench, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into a dirty glass. "Margaret is a private contractor. Ex-Mossad, actually. I pay her an exorbitant amount of money to keep me informed of Arthur's corporate maneuvers." "What do you want?" "I want my son," Campbell demanded. "And Thomas wants Arthur in federal prison. We have the original partnership agreements, the ones Arthur thought burned in the factory." William froze, the glass halfway to his lips. He slowly lowered it, his eyes darting between Thomas and Campbell. "You have the blue folder? Photographed and securely buried," Thomas confirmed. "Evelyn Roth in New York is on standby. She's ready to file the injunction to freeze all Hughes' assets the second we give the green light. But we can't do it while Leon is under David's roof. Arthur will use him as leverage. You need to extract the boy," William muttered, rubbing his jaw. He paced the length of the studio, the heavy silence broken only by the squeak of his boots on the concrete floor. "Your timing is a nightmare, Campbell. Arthur isn't waiting for the boy's 9th birthday to secure the perimeter." "What does that mean?" Campbell asked, a cold spike of panic piercing her chest. "David is leaving the country. Tomorrow night," William said grimly. "They're taking Leon to the family compound in St. Barthélemy. It's a fortress. Once the boy is on that private jet, he is legally and physically untouchable until the trust vests. If you want to get him out, it has to be tonight." "Tonight?" Thomas interjected, shaking his head. "That's impossible. We don't have the blueprints. We don't have a tactical strategy. Tonight is the annual Hughes Foundation Gala," William interrupted, his eyes gleaming with a sudden, chaotic energy. "Arthur and David will be downstairs in the ballroom, entertaining 300 of Atlanta's elite. The private family wing upstairs will be lightly guarded because the perimeter security will be focused on the guests. Margaret will be on duty with Leon." Campbell didn't hesitate. "Get me inside, William." "Campbell, this is madness," Thomas warned, grabbing her arm. "If they catch you trespassing, violating a court order, you will go to jail, and Evelyn's case will be compromised. If I don't go tonight, I lose my son forever." Campbell shot back, shaking off his hand. She turned to William. "Can Margaret disable the cameras on the 2nd floor?" William pulled a burner phone from his jacket pocket. Margaret can do a lot more than that. But you have to understand. Campbell, if this goes sideways, I don't know you. You are completely on your own. I've been on my own since the gavel dropped, Campbell said. Make the call. The Hughes estate in Buckhead looked less like a home and more like an opulent, terrifying embassy. By 9:00 p.m., the circular driveway was a sea of luxury vehicles. Valets sprinted between Bentleys and Maybachs, while women in haute couture and men in bespoke tuxedos filed through the massive oak double doors. Campbell sat in the back of Thomas's unassuming grey sedan, parked 2 blocks down the street, hidden in the deep shadows of the ancient oak trees. She was dressed entirely in black dark jeans, a fitted turtleneck, and soft-soled running shoes. Her heart drummed a frantic, sickening rhythm against her ribs. Earpiece check, Thomas said from the driver's seat. Campbell pressed a finger to the tiny, flesh-coloured comms unit William had provided. I hear you. Margaret just sent the signal, Thomas reported, his eyes glued to a glowing tablet screen. She has initiated a diagnostic loop on the secondary camera feeds. You have exactly 14 minutes to get in, get Leon, and get out before the security firm's automated system flags the dead air. Campbell slipped out of the car. The humid Georgia air clung to her as she jogged through the manicured hedges, dividing the Hughes property from the neighbouring estate. William had provided her with the blind spots in the perimeter, a narrow strip of darkness along the eastern stone wall. She scaled the wrought iron side gate, dropping silently onto the soft, damp grass of the service gardens. The pulsing bass of a string quartet echoed from the grand ballroom at the front of the house. Campbell kept low, sprinting from the shadow of a stone fountain to the edge of the catering tents set up near the kitchen entrance. She slipped past 2 smoking chefs and reached the heavy steel service door, leading to the basement. It was unlocked Margaret's doing. Campbell plunged into the dimly lit corridor. The basement smelled of expensive wine and industrial bleach. She navigated the maze of storage rooms and electrical panels, her memory perfectly recalling the blueprints William had sketched out on a napkin just hours prior. Up the servants' stairs, 2nd floor, 3rd door on the left. She pushed open the stairwell door. The muffled sounds of the gala grew louder as she climbed to the ground floor, then faded as she ascended to the restricted family wing. She cracked the 2nd floor door open. The hallway was vast, lined with Persian runners and priceless oil paintings. It was empty. The secondary security cameras stationed at the corners of the ceiling glowed with a faint, steady red light. The diagnostic loop. Campbell sprinted silently down the hall. 1st door, 2nd door, 3rd door. She turned the brass handle. It wasn't locked. She slipped inside, closing the door behind her. The room was softly lit by a bedside lamp shaped like a rocket ship. In the center of the massive, custom-built bed was a small lump hidden beneath a heavy down comforter. Leon. Campbell breathed. She rushed to the bedside. Leon was asleep, a children's book splayed open on his chest. Campbell's chest hitched, a desperate sob fighting to escape her throat. She gently shook his shoulder. Leon, baby, wake up. Leon stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. For a second, he looked confused, his mind still tethered to sleep. Then, his eyes widened. Mommy? Shh, Campbell whispered, pressing a finger to her lips. She hauled him into a tight, desperate embrace, breathing in the scent of him. I'm here, sweetie. I'm taking you home. Dad said you weren't allowed to come here, Leon mumbled, rubbing his eyes. Dad was wrong. We have to go, right now. Put your shoes on. The bathroom door suddenly swung open. Campbell shot to her feet, her blood turning to ice. A tall, austere woman with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes stepped into the bedroom. It was Margaret. She was dressed in a pristine nanny's uniform, but the suppressed pistol holstered tightly to her hip completely shattered the illusion. You're 2 minutes behind schedule, Margaret whispered, her accent crisp and authoritative. She handed Campbell a small dark backpack. His essentials are in there. Passports, medical records. Move. Thank you, Campbell breathed. Don't thank me, just walk, Margaret commanded. Take the back service elevator. It bypasses the kitchen and exits near the greenhouse. Campbell grabbed Leon's hand. They were halfway to the bedroom door when the heavy, unmistakable sound of dress shoes echoed from the hallway. Someone was walking toward the room. The footsteps were unhurried, arrogant. David. Campbell froze. The earpiece crackled violently. Campbell! Thomas's voice hissed in her ear. Arthur had a coughing fit and went to his study, but David just left the ballroom. He's heading upstairs. Get out of the hallway! He's right outside, Campbell whispered in pure terror. Margaret's eyes narrowed. She grabbed Campbell and Leon, shoving them toward the massive, walk-in closet. Get in. Do not make a sound. Campbell pulled Leon into the dark depths of the cedar-lined closet, crouching behind a row of David's tailored winter coats. She clamped a hand over Leon's mouth, pulling him tight against her chest. A second later, the bedroom door opened. Margaret. David's voice drifted into the room, smooth and laced with quiet cruelty. Why is my son awake? He had a bad dream, Mr. Hughes. Margaret replied smoothly, her voice betraying zero panic. I was just getting him a glass of water. Through the crack in the closet door, Campbell saw David's shadow fall across the floor. He walked slowly toward the center of the room. Is that so? Strange. I thought I heard another voice in here. Just me, sir. Singing him back to sleep, David stopped. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like it would snap. Campbell's heart hammered so violently she was certain David could hear it. Leon was trembling against her. Make sure he's asleep, David finally said, his tone chillingly flat. We leave for the island at 6:00 a.m. I don't want him cranky for the flight. Of course, sir. Footsteps retreated. The bedroom door clicked shut. Campbell let out a breath. She felt she had been holding for an eternity. Margaret opened the closet door, her face a mask of grim urgency. He didn't buy it. He's going to check the perimeter cameras. The loop drops in 60 seconds. Go. Now. Campbell grabbed Leon, hoisting him onto her hip despite his age. Adrenaline flooded her muscles, granting her a terrifying, hysterical strength. She bolted from the bedroom, sprinting down the hallway toward the service elevator. 50 seconds. She slammed the call button. The elevator arrived instantly. They stepped inside, and the doors slid shut just as the red lights on the security cameras shifted from a steady glow to a frantic, blinking green. The loop had ended. Campbell, they have a visual, Thomas yelled through the earpiece. The security system just flagged the elevator. They know you're in the house. The elevator jolted to a stop on the basement level. As the doors opened, the blaring, high-pitched shriek of the estate's security alarm shattered the quiet of the night. Run! Leon! Campbell screamed. She grabbed his hand, and they tore through the basement corridor, bursting out of the steel service door into the humid night air. Across the lawn, flashlight beams were already sweeping the manicured hedges. Private security guards in black tactical gear were swarming out of the side entrances, shouting orders over the blaring alarm. Mommy, I'm scared, Leon cried. Keep looking at me, baby. Just run. They sprinted toward the stone fountain. A guard rounded the corner of the catering tent, his flashlight beam catching them dead to rights. Halt! Stop right there! He bellowed, reaching for his radio. Before he could speak into it, a dark figure materialized from the shadows behind him. Margaret. She swept the guard's legs out from under him, delivering a brutal, precise strike to his neck. The guard crumpled to the grass, unconscious. The eastern gate, Margaret barked. Go. Campbell practically dragged Leon across the final stretch of lawn. She hoisted him over the wrought iron fence, ignoring the sharp metal scraping her side, and vaulted over after him. They hit the pavement of the side street. Thomas's sedan came screeching around the corner, headlights off, tires smoking on the asphalt. The rear door flew open. Campbell shoved Leon inside and dove in after him. "Drive!" she screamed. Thomas slammed on the gas. The sedan fishtailed violently before rocketing down the tree-lined street, leaving the flashing lights and blaring sirens of the Hughes estate in the rearview mirror. Campbell collapsed against the leather seat, pulling a weeping Leon into her arms. She kissed the top of his head, her chest heaving, her hands covered in dirt and scraped skin. "We got him," Thomas said, his voice trembling as he navigated a sharp turn onto the main thoroughfare. He reached for his phone. "I'm calling Evelyn. Tell her to drop the hammer," Campbell said, her eyes fixed on the retreating shadows of Buckhead. "Tell her to burn Arthur Hughes to the ground." By 8:00 am the following morning, the Hughes family empire was quietly, legally decapitated. 1,000 miles away in Manhattan, Evelyn Roth, a senior partner at the formidable corporate litigation firm Roth, Caldwell and Pierce, walked into the Daniel Patrick Moynihan United States Courthouse. She didn't carry a briefcase, only a slim, encrypted tablet. Evelyn had spent the last 8 hours awake, fueled by black espresso and cold vengeance, coordinating with Thomas Abernathy and a contact at the FBI's white-collar crime division, Special Agent Jonathan Miller. When Evelyn filed the emergency injunction, she didn't just target Arthur Hughes's domestic real estate holdings. Armed with the photographed ledgers from Beatrice's lockbox, she dropped a tactical nuke on the Hughes Corporation's offshore shell companies. The injunction cited grand larceny, systemic wire fraud, and the embezzlement of Elias Reed's foundational patents. Because the original trust explicitly stated that any fraud perpetrated against the Reed bloodline triggered an immediate reversion of assets, Evelyn filed a simultaneous motion in family court to strip David of his paternal rights, citing flight risk and criminal conspiracy. At 8:45 am, Arthur and David Hughes arrived at DeKalb, Peachtree Airport, expecting to board their Gulfstream G650 for St. Barthélemy. Instead, they were greeted by 6 black Chevrolet Suburbans parked across the tarmac. Special Agent Miller stepped out of the lead vehicle, holding a stack of federal warrants. "Arthur C. Hughes, David Hughes," Miller announced, his voice carrying over the whine of a distant jet engine. "Your aircraft is grounded. By order of the Southern District of New York, your assets, including all offshore accounts tied to the Hughes Trust, are officially frozen." David's perfectly manicured facade cracked. His face went ashen, his eyes darting frantically toward the private plane. "On what grounds? This is a mistake. My lawyers—" "Your lawyers are currently being locked out of their offices, David," Miller interrupted, handing a thick manila envelope to Arthur. "Evelyn Roth sends her regards. She suggested you read the addendum regarding Elias Reed." Arthur Hughes, a man who had built his life on crushing others with terrifying, silent precision, took the envelope. His hands, usually so steady, betrayed a slight tremor. He opened the file. Staring back at him was a high-resolution photograph of the very partnership agreement he had ordered burned 35 years ago. The color drained from the billionaire's face. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. In a way, he had. Meanwhile, Campbell and Leon were safe. They were sequestered in an FBI safe house in the rural outskirts of Athens, Georgia. Thomas Abernathy sat at the kitchen table, monitoring the news feeds on his laptop, while Campbell made pancakes. It was the first time she had cooked for her son in what felt like a lifetime. Leon was sitting on the sofa, watching cartoons, blissfully unaware of the tectonic plates shifting beneath his family's name. He only knew that his mother had come for him in the dark, like a superhero, and that the scary men at his father's house couldn't hurt them anymore. "It's everywhere, Campbell," Thomas said, a rare, genuine smile breaking across his weathered face. He turned the laptop screen toward her. The chyron on the bottom of a major news network read, "Hughes, Dynasty in crisis. Billionaire CEO under federal investigation for fraud." Evelyn didn't just file the suit. She leaked the unclassified portions of the intelligence dossier to the press, Thomas explained. The part about David targeting you. The public is eating it up. The board of directors at Hughes Corp just called an emergency meeting. They're voting to oust Arthur and David by noon to save the stock price. Campbell set the spatula down. She walked over to the window, looking out at the quiet, sun-drenched woods surrounding the safe house. A profound, heavy relief washed over her, so intense it made her knees weak. The monsters were bleeding, but the war wasn't completely over. She had to face David one last time. 3 weeks later, the air inside the Fulton County Courthouse smelled exactly as Campbell remembered it, a sterile blend of industrial floor wax and the stale, sour scent of lingering anxiety. But as she stepped through the heavy double doors of room 402, the crushing weight that had paralyzed her a month ago was entirely absent. The power dynamic in the room had violently, permanently inverted. Campbell sat at the plaintiff's table. She wasn't trembling this time. Her knuckles weren't white with panic. She wore a sharp, impeccably tailored navy suit, her posture straight and grounded. Beside her sat Evelyn Roth, an imposing force of nature with sleek silver hair and a gaze that could cut through tempered glass. Evelyn didn't fidget. She sat with the terrifying, serene stillness of an apex predator, watching a trapped meal. Across the center aisle, David Hughes looked nothing like the untouchable CEO who had smirked at Campbell's devastation. The polished, predatory grooming was gone. He looked hollowed out, his skin carrying a sickly grey pallor under the fluorescent lights. His bespoke charcoal suit, once a symbol of his armor, now hung slightly loose on his frame, hinting at weeks of sleepless nights and relentless federal interrogations. His father, Arthur, was glaringly absent. The patriarch of the Hughes empire had been denied bail by a federal judge who deemed him an extreme flight risk. A swift decision made incredibly easy after Margaret Higgins had accidentally discovered a stash of forged passports in Time C2. Arthur's study and promptly handed them over to the FBI. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open, and Judge Harrison took his seat. This was the same man who had confidently stripped Campbell of her child, citing her instability. Now, he looked deeply uncomfortable, refusing to meet Campbell's eye. The massive federal indictment hanging over the Hughes family had cast a humiliating, very public shadow over his previous ruling, and the local press was already circling his chambers. "We are here to review the emergency petition regarding the custody of Leon Hughes," Judge Harrison began, clearing his throat loudly into the microphone. "Given the unprecedented federal charges of fraud, conspiracy, and the recent public revelation of the Reed Trust, the court is compelled to reevaluate the child's living environment." David's new defense attorney, a nervous-looking man with a sheen of sweat on his forehead, who clearly realized he was steering a rapidly sinking ship, stood up. He adjusted his tie, his voice lacking any real conviction. "Your Honor, my client vehemently maintains his innocence regarding the corporate charges brought in New York. However, regarding family court matters, he is still a fit father. The federal investigation does not negate—" "Your client," Evelyn Roth interrupted, not bothering to stand, her voice slicing through the courtroom's quiet like a scalpel, "is a co-conspirator who married my client under fraudulent pretenses, explicitly to maintain control of a stolen empire." The defense attorney sputtered, but Evelyn stood up, commanding the room's oxygen. "We have the sworn testimony of William Hughes and the financial paper trail proving David Hughes knowingly financed the surveillance, harassment, and psychological manipulation of Campbell Reed," Evelyn continued, slamming a heavy, leather-bound binder onto the mahogany table. The dull thud echoed like a gunshot. "Furthermore, Your Honor, as of 9:00 a.m. this morning, the Hughes Foundational Trust has matured. Because Arthur Hughes's original claim to the assets was proven by federal investigators to be founded on the murder and embezzlement of Elias Reed, the trust's legal kill switch has been activated." David closed his eyes, his head dropping a fraction of an inch. 51% of the Hughes Corporation, Evelyn announced, her voice ringing with absolute finality, now legally belongs to Campbell Reed, as the sole guardian of the Reed Hughes heir. David Hughes doesn't just lack the moral fitness to parent. As of this morning, he lacks the financial empire he used to manipulate this court. A suffocating, heavy silence fell over the courtroom. The court reporter's fingers hovered motionless over her keys. David stared blindly at the desk in front of him, his jaw clenched so tight the muscle twitched visibly. He couldn't bring himself to look at Campbell. Judge Harrison flipped through the summary brief Evelyn had submitted, his face pale. He didn't deliberate long. "Custody," Judge Harrison said, his voice stripped of its former arrogance, "is hereby awarded immediately and solely to the mother, Campbell Reed. Furthermore, Mr. Hughes's visitation rights are suspended indefinitely, pending the outcome of his federal criminal trial in the Southern District of New York." The gavel struck the sound block. This time, the sharp wooden clack didn't shatter Campbell's reality. It rebuilt it, piece by piece, sealing the cracks they had forced upon her. As the gallery cleared and the lawyers began packing their briefcases, Campbell stood up. She walked slowly across the aisle, stopping inches from David's table. He finally looked up at her. His eyes were completely hollow, swimming with a toxic mixture of bitter hatred and profound, absolute defeat. "You think you won?" David sneered, his voice a pathetic, rasping whisper that barely carried over the rustling papers. "You have no idea what you're doing. You have no idea how to run a multi-billion-dollar company. You're just a freelancer from Decatur." Campbell looked down at the man who had been assigned to ruin her life. She felt no anger anymore, only a chilling, calm pity. "I don't plan on running it, David," Campbell replied, her voice smooth and absolute. "I plan on liquidating it. Every brick, every patent, every offshore account. I'm going to use your father's stolen money to build a charitable foundation in my grandfather's name." She leaned in just slightly, ensuring he heard every syllable of her final sentence. "And then, I'm going to take my son, and you are never going to see either of us again." Campbell didn't wait for his response. She turned her back on the wreckage of the Hughes dynasty and walked down the center aisle. She pushed open the heavy courtroom doors and stepped out into the bright, blinding, beautiful sunlight of Atlanta, ready to go home to her son. The mountain air in North Carolina was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and impending autumn. Campbell sat on the wraparound porch of Beatrice's cabin, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands. The A-frame structure was no longer a dusty relic of isolation. It was fully restored, buzzing with warmth and life. A newly paved driveway wound down the ridge, and the old broken windows had been replaced with thick, clear glass, overlooking the sprawling valley. In the yard below, Leon was laughing, chasing a golden retriever puppy through the tall grass. He was safe. He was free from the suffocating shadows of a family that only saw him as a corporate asset. Campbell watched her son, feeling the deep, rhythmic beating of her own heart, no longer racing with terror, but steady with peace. The inheritance had given her power, but the true victory wasn't the billions she had claimed. The victory was the sunlight catching her son's smile, the silence of the mountains, and the absolute certainty that no one would ever dictate their lives again.